A new report by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has really laid threadbare how close the globe is to being right on the edge. And by that we're talking about climate change and the implications of what a 1.5 degree rise in global temperatures might actually imply for all of us. We are losing this battle at this stage. What exactly is at stake? Take a look.
Recent disasters across India, but scientists in a major climate change report by the UN say such incidents will occur more frequently. More heat waves, more droughts, melting glaciers, intense one-day rainfall, coastal flooding, more cyclones. The frequency and intensity of such disasters are not natural but human-made.
We'll see more compound events from sea level rise, so flooding. Even if we stop emitting right now or stop global warming at 1.5 degrees, we will see further retreat of glaciers, including in the Himalayas.
Why is this happening? The reason for such rapid climate change is human activity. It is producing massive amounts of heat-absorbing greenhouse gases or GHGs released by burning fossil fuels like coal and petroleum products, deforestation and agriculture. These greenhouse gases trap heat and warm the climate.
And unprecedented for the IPCC.
The report by the IPCC or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, of which India is one of the 195 member nations, says global warming will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next 20 years. It is currently about 1.1 degrees and the landmark 2015 Paris Climate Agreement had identified 1.5 degrees as the goal to limit warming. Globally, 1 in 10-year hot extreme events will occur 5 times more frequently at 2 degrees Celsius. At 4 degrees, these 1 in 10 events will likely happen 9.4 times in a 10-year period, nearly once a year on average. Ahead of the Glasgow Climate Conference later this year, the report is a key tool to get governments to step up their pledges to cut emissions, just like the last assessment report did for the Paris Conference. But as of now, several big countries have announced net zero targets by around 2050-2060, but India has pushed back on global pressure to do so. India says developed nations don't consider the rights of developing countries to economic growth. India wants the G20 countries to reduce per capita emissions. India is the third largest polluter but has one of the lowest per capita emissions, especially among large economies. So far, almost all pledges by governments fall short of the Paris Conference's target to keep warming ideally to 1.5 degrees. Now they are being called upon to make even more immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in emissions.
Yeah, this is a very, very good point.
However, one of the report's authors says India should focus on alternative strategies, not a net zero.
India is supposed to reduce the emission intensity. On the net emissions, we are not asked to reduce immediately. But we improve our system so that we, per dollar of income, we emit less emissions. If you do waste management better, if you do like a vehicular management better, if you improve the thermal power plant. For thermal power plant also have the efficiency issue, right? You can improve the efficiency of thermal power plant.
This report has rung a lot of alarm bells, and that is why climate conferences, which usually see more blame games than action, are expected to deal with the crisis better this time. 195 IPCC member countries are going to decide the fate of 7 billion people and also of our future generations. In New Delhi with Chetan Bhattacharjee and camera person Rakesh Singh, this is Sukirti Dwivedi for NDTV.
Well, joining us now to look at the implications of that report, Alka Kelkar, Director of Climate at the World Resources Institute, India. We're also joined by Roxy Matthew Cole, a climate scientist at the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology. I'm also joined by Arunabha Ghosh, Founder CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and Professor Krishna Achyuta Rao, the Professor at the Center for Atmospheric Sciences at IIT Delhi. Thank you all very much for being with us. Roxy Matthew Cole, what are the implications of the world hitting a hike in terms of temperature of 1.5 degrees by 2030?
Well, the sixth assessment report that came out just today, it has some startling news for us. It says that the climate has changed forever in terms of human time scales. That is, some of the changes that we already see in terms of floods, droughts, cyclones are probably irreversible because the lifespan of carbon dioxide is quite long, and the oceans are absorbing the heat in a slow process for over a long time. So the global mean temperature of 1.5 degrees Celsius limit will be met in the current decade or next, and the 2 degrees Celsius during 2040 to 2060 in the next subsequent decades. And this is because human-caused carbon dioxide emissions are increasing, and our current strategies of mitigation and adaptation are insufficient to stop it from changing further.
Okay. Alka Kelkar, sea levels are also rising. The average rate of seawater rise between 1901 and 1971 was 1.3 millimeters a year. Global mean sea level has increased by 0.20, in other words 0.15 to 0.25 meters between 1901 and 2018. In simple terms, what does this mean? In fact, just one more statistic. The rise in seawater levels has doubled to 3.7 millimeters a year between 2006 to 2018. So what happens if sea levels rise faster? Would it, other than flooding of low-lying areas, what are the other implications?
Thanks, Vishnu. I think sometimes when we say these numbers, they sound very small. I mean, what's a few degrees of warming to, those of us who live in India, or, what's a little bit of sea level rise to people living along the coast. But the problem with some of these smaller degrees of warming or smaller amounts of sea level rise is when you have the compounded risks that Roxy just spoke about. So, for example, when you have an incessant rainfall that continues over the period of 24 hours or more, and coincides with periods of high tide. And at the same time, we have a city which doesn't have adequate natural drainage that is designed for this once in century kind of event to happen every year almost. Then what you have is a compounding of various kinds of hazards. And so that is really the problem that the IPCC report points out. It also warns us that its best estimate is 3 degrees Celsius. But we are moving towards a future when you have so much melting of the ice sheets in the Greenland and the Arctic that it could almost disrupt the ocean currents that moderate our climate system.
Right.
So it could also lead to more unprecedented and irreversible changes that we haven't thought of in the past.
Professor Achyutarao, another key point is that once in 10-year and once in 50-year events of extreme heat, heavy rain and droughts will be more frequent and more intense. Would you say that what we are seeing in terms of temperature rises in our own country, lots of droughts, exceptionally heavy rainfall, for example in parts of Maharashtra in the last couple of years, is linked to climate change, and that across the country we need to prepare for many more such events?
I think you're absolutely right. There's a fair warning that the monsoon is going to become not only stronger, but also more variable. That means that your high excess monsoons and the deficit monsoons are going to be more stark, and that in itself is going to be a problem. So your monsoons that you were kind of relying on to be the steady influx of rain and feeding the farmers and everybody is no longer going to be that moderating influence. It could be coming down heavier and more frequently varying on the negative in a deficit side. So this is indeed something that that is in the report as a warning, that these variations in the monsoon are going to get worse or more extreme. Similarly with heat waves and heavy rainfall events. What is compared in the report is how frequent these are compared to let's say, sometime in the late 19th century, when we didn't have as much human-induced climate change as we do now. So when you keep adding more and more carbon dioxide, you're just going to start loading the dice in terms of making these kinds of extreme events more and more frequent and more intense.
Yep.
So both droughts, heat waves, as well as heavy rainfall events are going to keep rising. And with each 0.1 degree of rainfall of warming that you will experience, these odds change.
Right.
And as you go from 1.5 to 2 or even higher, heaven forbid, you will experience more and more of these extreme events.
Arunabha Ghosh, what is the implication of the increase in glacial melt in the Himalayas? How will your life and my life change over, say, the next 10 years?
Vishnu, as Roxy was also saying, look, we are now committed to over 1.5 degrees of warming, and that's going to rise more. Now, this will precipitate glacial melt in the Himalayas. It will precipitate Arctic sea ice melting. And this is the first thing we have to recognize, that our worries do not stop at our borders. What is happening far away geographically for us is still going to have an implication. Arctic melt will have an implication on what is happening in the tropics. So the intensity of glacial melt, the intensity of rainfalls, as Professor Achutara was talking about, all that will increase, but it will also result in severe damages to the built infrastructure. And this is where it is important to think about all of these issues beyond just the environmental dimension. India is a growing economy. We are going to put in more cement and concrete and hard infrastructure in the coming decades than what we have in the past, which means the economic damage from these extreme weather events. We've had 300 plus extreme weather events since 1990 alone, resulting in 5.6 lakh crore of damages for India alone. But the past is no longer going to be a predictor of the future. Your damages are going to actually increase as we develop.
Right.
Because it's more of the damages to the hard infrastructure, more of the damages to lives and livelihoods that we'll have to quantify.
Yeah.
So the biggest implication I would take away from this report is, please stop thinking about climate change as an issue for climate scientists and environmentalists. If we do not push this issue from the margins of our consciousness to the mainstream of our economic and political and social discourse, we're done for.
Wow. Alka, a rise in seawater temperatures and an increase in temperatures of seawaters would be devastating for coral, right? In our chains, the Lakshadweep chain, Andaman and Nicobar Island chain, the islands themselves will thereby become much more vulnerable. But the impact on marine species which so define these islands and some of our coastal areas and our shallow seas would be devastating as well. No one talks about this.
Certainly. I think it's very important to understand how sensitive some of these ecosystems are, but equally it is important to pay attention to how much we depend on these ecosystems for our livelihoods. So for example, you have farmers who grow paddy and rice, but the groundwater that is near the coast is going to get salt water intruded into it and become more salty, making that paddy difficult or unsuited for these future conditions. Same with fishermen, for example. Another very important tragedy that happened recently during Cyclone Tauktae was the Bombay High disaster, where a barge was caught in a severe storm. So our energy infrastructure is equally vulnerable to some of these changes in sea level and warming, as well as storms that we are seeing more and more around the world. I think even in Texas, for example, there was a cold weather storm that froze everybody's power lines and water lines. This was in February. Wildfires in California are actually causing the first climate bankruptcy. A business, P3G&E, went out of business because it was held liable for not taking adequate measures to underground the power sector lines that are vulnerable to wildfires. So I think more and more, even if we talk about ecosystems, nature, it is affecting every part of our lives, of our economy, and of the livelihoods that depend on this.
Yeah. Roxy, there does appear to be around the world a huge move towards electric transportation, electric cars, electric buses, much cleaner subway systems, metro systems. Now I know that that brings the argument back to batteries. And are batteries made in an environmentally friendly manner? The answer is no, they are not. But leaving that aside for just a moment, by 2030, I suppose if all of us over here on this panel do drive cars at that stage and not rely on public transport exclusively, we would all be driving electric cars. Now, if this is going to happen around the world because there's been this shift in technology which has become acceptable, will our lives not get a little better and safer from an environmental standpoint?
Well, by cutting down all the emissions, the best thing we can attain is to stop these intense extreme events from accelerating further. So whatever changes that we are having right now will be here for centuries. That's the IPCC report, what it shows. But we can stop it from accelerating further, stop the storms from accelerating, from intensifying further, stop the extreme rains from being widespread further. So that is the best thing we can achieve from that. But I have a different point to make, and that is that while curbing our emissions through electric vehicles and energy efficient methods, there is one part we are not focusing on. So what do we do when these extreme weather events happen? The only thing that India generally does is evacuate people. We depend on forecasts and early warning systems and evacuate people.
Yes.
But we cannot keep on evacuating people. We cannot wait for forecasts to happen. So a cyclone happens in the next 2-3 days. We ask the disaster management to be on ground and evacuate people. So occasionally lives are saved, but livelihoods, we have severe damage of property and infrastructure, and not only that, this happens in the cities, but in rural areas we have severe damage for agriculture, like what we saw in the recent Maharashtra floods, and it's now going on in UP. So what we need is a long-term solution, and what IPCC provides right now is more of a large-scale picture of how the climate is changing, extreme weather events are changing, but we need to go fine scale on it. We need to go on district level, because while climate change is global, the impacts and the challenges are local. Yeah. So we need to disaster proof each and every district of India, because their climate change challenges are unique.
Right. Professor Achyuta Rao, a last question to you. India, unfortunately, still relies very heavily on thermal energy. It just seems that as much as we try and grow our economy, we keep relying more and more or at the same level on thermal energy. There's the entire issue of efficiency associated with thermal energy plants. Is it your belief that unless India moves decisively away from thermal energy and decisively away from the argument that, look, we still pollute much less as a percentage than China or the United States, we're going to be stuck in the same trap, that we don't want to invest in new cleaner technology, and we justify that by saying, but you know, you guys are all bad, America, you polluted so much more, China, you polluted so much more, don't look at us. And that argument will get us nowhere.
I'm not a policy expert. I don't want to pretend to understand all the nuances that go into a government policy. But I will say this, as the IPCC has pointed out, this reduction in CO2 and other greenhouse gases is not negotiable. This is not something that one can sit back and say, I will sit this game out and I'll play it later.
Right.
This is something that is a global problem, and unless every country participates in this effort to reduce CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions, we are not going to get there. Yeah. And the sad part is that whether or not we reduce emissions, it has to be a global collective effort, and only then will the CO2-driven climate change reduce. The climate doesn't care if the carbon dioxide comes from India or the US. What the climate does is take that CO2 and greenhouse gas, warm it up, and pump up your extremes and other disastrous events that we see unfolding already. So each additional molecule of CO2 that goes out, whether it has the Indian CO2 or the American CO2, the effect is going to be the same. So I think the policy-wise, it is important to look at this as a global commons issue and address it as such.
I have exactly 30 seconds left. Arunabha, you had a quick comment. Go ahead.
I just wanted to comment, Vishnu, on your point about efficiency of our power plants. And what we know at CW, we've just released the study that we can shut down 30 gigawatts of our coal power plants and make our electricity system actually more efficient if we drew power from more efficient power plants, and would save the power system over $1 billion annually. So while we are fixing the climate, we can also fix the economy if we just focused on the more efficient assets we have while we invest in the cleaner technologies of the future.
Right. Well, we seem to be endorsing a lot of nuclear energy as clean energy. I'm not sure that is necessarily the right step forward, but perhaps in the immediate run it meets our requirements. I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us and explaining to our viewers in such simple terms what we are staring at. This is a catastrophe, very much similar, in its dimension, perhaps even greater than what we've gone through with COVID.